This is Countdown to the Open. I'm Lisa Abramowitz in for Jonathan Farrow. We just are moments away from the start of trading. We have seen a volatile session starting with some strength. It has faded as we head closer to the open. S&P futures now solidly negative, down 0.1%. The Nasdaq's given up almost all of their gains. Russell still maintaining up to 0.2%. What's happening in the bond space, though, yields lower, even as we get the fastest pace of price inflation for producers going back to 2010. You do see that 2-year yield, that 10-year yield going to 2.6987% from 2.82% at the high yesterday. And the dollar strengthening does persist. I have to say, this is a very confusing moment. I am here with Tom Keene, with Kaylee Lyons. We are broadcasting both on radio as well as on television at a delicate moment where we're looking at earnings reflecting both strength when you take a look at Delta and the incredible demand, and then you look at JP Morgan talking about increased credit loss provisions as a result of some of this uncertainty. Peter Scheer has been parsing through all of this and has a fantastic view joining us right now. Peter Scheer, of course, with macroeconomics, with the full view. What's your view on how we should read this moment?
So I'm starting with equities. I think equities right now are, to me, an easier read. I expect equity indices to go back to the pre-March Fed lows. So I think we get back and retest that. So I think you're going to see ongoing pressure in the equity markets. To me, that translates to pressure on credit spreads. So I think we see credit spreads widen, particularly the IG sector, which has held in pretty well in the last month or so. And then finally, on treasury yields, it's a little bit more up in the air. I really actually think the 2-year, 3-year, 4-year space, I want to be buying those. I think those yields can head lower. I'm a little bit more confused in the 10s to 30s.
Peter, you're great at looking across equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. I'm seeing tangible currency signals of an unraveling with euro almost hitting a 107. It's almost like a David Folkers Landau moaning from Deutsche Bank with the depreciation we're seeing against the dollar. From where you sit at Academy, is the system malleable now and functionable, or do you look at it with kinks or with breakpoints?
So I think we're at this early stages of a real shift in how we have to think about Europe, how we have to think about dealing with autocratic nations, not just Russia, but also China, the Middle East. And I think that's creating this new shift where you're getting the commodity nations and the autocrats aligning with China because China is a massive consumer of what they're selling. They need it. I think Europe is going to struggle. I think you're going to start seeing all these second order effects. And you don't know what it's going to be, whether it's going to be car harnesses or neon production. Europe's going to have a lot of trouble, and food's going to be a problem over the summer as well. So I think it makes sense to avoid European assets right now.
Well, and when we're talking about food, that leads me to the idea of just higher prices across the board, higher input costs that companies are facing. You're starting to see that showing up in earnings. Bed Bath & Beyond, one example, it's down about 12% at the opening bell after posting a surprise loss, warning of supply chain issues. And the interesting line out of the company is that they're starting to see consumer demand taking a hit. Peter, are we reaching or at the limit of the ability of these companies to exercise pricing power and to pass costs on?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate right now. People are just kind of getting hit left, right, and center, right? Whether it's gas, whether it's food, whether it's all the goods and services they're buying. So we're seeing that. At the same time, you're seeing mortgage rates go spike higher. So I think you could get this double whammy where consumers are a little bit spent out, they're tapped out, it's getting too expensive for them to buy, and the housing market could start turning very quickly. So that's why I do think that the Fed is going to be able to maintain QT, which is dangerous for stocks. I think they're going to have to backpedal on all the rate hike talk, though, because I think that the economy is more precarious than people are talking about.
And Peter, this is perhaps reflected in the banking sector as well as we parse through some of the earnings and take a look at some of the opening bell moves. JP Morgan now down substantially, at one point down more than 4%, now down about 3%. But I was just looking, that is the lowest since January 5th, 2021. For perspective, JP Morgan gained 25% last year. We have almost erased those gains. Peter, what is this saying at a point when we are seeing a re-steepening in the yield curve and you're actually getting some income for overnight rates?
Well, what I think is people overestimate what 2s10s means for banks. Most banks are fairly well hedged, and that affects their income, but that's really slow and over time. Where banks make a lot of their money is on transactions. And if you see that housing market slow, the number of refis goes down, the number of new mortgages go down. I think that's a bigger hit. If people start tapping out of their credit cards and saying, hey, I better start paying this off now because yields are getting too high. So I think you could see a bit of a consumer-led slowdown, a housing-led slowdown. And that to me is much worse for bank earnings than anything to do with 2s10s yield curve.
Peter, a lot of people will say this is an overbeared market. People have gotten so bearish and so down in the dumps at a time when companies are still doing pretty well. How do you sort of parse through that noise, which is real, and come up with some sort of conviction about the direction of travel?
You know, I think it's very tricky. You try and sit here and read the signs and occasionally get lucky, like yesterday morning where we were telling people, okay, we're bearish, but it felt like it really wanted to pop after CPI. We got that. That got you a chance to reload. So you're managing that. And it does seem, though, it swings excessively to extreme bearishness, to extreme bullishness. One thing we spend a lot of time thinking about is that there is very little liquidity either direction, right? We always think about no liquidity on the way down. There's no liquidity on the way up or down, which means any signal you get is lost. So I think you've got to be a little bit nimble. You're running smaller position sizes. So I'm trading this from the bearish side. And again, at the back of that, you look for long ideas. I want to be long some emerging markets, especially Latin and South America. I love the oil and energy space. I think we are going to spend so much money not only building out sustainable energy, but reinvesting and refocusing on traditional energy sources. The oil services, those companies like that are going to do very, very well. So there's opportunities within this whole kind of mess to try and trade around.
Peter, you know the Lehman Index, the Bloomberg aggregate indexes, the credit index, I believe, is down 13%, pretty much the largest drawdown in history. That's French Peter Chier at Academy for a bond bear market. I'm fascinated by the equity language. Do you buy the bond dip?
So I want to start shifting into some bonds. I think you are going to see people looking at this and saying, okay, this is a little bit more permanent. And to me, when we had quantitative easing, what that does is at every part of the point on the yield curve and risk curve, someone gets pushed out, and I think the reverse is going to happen on the way back in.
Okay,
I think you're going to see Bitcoin.
Peter, come on, we're friends. We've been doing this a while. Peter, you're at Academy of Securities. Your monthly statement is delivered by Carrier Pigeon or whatever they do. You know, you bunch of Navy guys. Great. I'm looking at my monthly statement, and I'm south 3 years yield or 4 years yield. You're telling me to buy the dip?
First off, I think on the retail side, everyone just keeps contributing to AGG and BND monthly. It's in their 401ks. I think you've already seen a lot of selling pressures. When you look at the ETFs, there's been already a lot of outflow. So I think people are able to reload right now. It's the institutional investors that are driving. I think people are starting to take a little bit of a nibble at yields here.
What does that mean for the equity market, Peter, when it didn't seem to blink at yields at 2 3/4%? Are we going to reach the point where it does indeed blink and the TINA thesis is called into question?
Yeah, I think we're at that stage right now. I think we're already seeing that where if you take a look at Bitcoin, right, it keeps struggling. And as yields go higher, risk assets, when you look at, say, the higher risk tech stocks, right, they've done worse. So I think you're seeing people reprice risk, and they're focused on steady growth. They're focused on dividends. They're looking for opportunity. They're looking for energy. So I think you're going to, again, I'm not comfortable with equities until they get back to both the March levels of this year, which for most coincides with May 21 levels. So I think that's where we get back. It's another, around 4,200 or something on the S&P, maybe a bit lower. That's where I can get constructive again.
And what's going to be the leadership to the downside, if that makes sense, Peter? What creates the drag? What area of the equity market in particular?
And I think it's still going to be this, the big high-tech stocks where people question the valuations, where people say, well, you know what, we got a good run, we can take some gains, look for something else. And maybe we just want to be a little bit conservative with so much going on right now.
Peter Chier, thank you so much for being with us, of Academy Securities, head of macro strategy. Some really insightful moments as we take a look at a lot of bearishness, yes, but a resilient market nonetheless. Even, Kaylee, to your point, as we talked about rate hikes, even when we talked about how high yields were going, stocks didn't blink. Have we reached a point, Kaylee, where actually if yields go down, that's bad for stocks at a time when inflation is still so rampant?
I don't know how we can parse through what is good news and what is bad news. If good news news can be bad news simultaneously, Lisa, especially when it comes to this earnings season. If we do indeed see companies able to continue to exercise pricing power, increasing the cost further for the consumer in order to offset the higher input costs they are facing, does that not exacerbate the inflation problem and create a bigger problem for the Federal Reserve that could potentially result in more aggressive action? I mean, it's all circular, and it's really just it's hard to see through it.
I was about to say, Tom, my head's starting to hurt, and I'm wondering, have you ever in your entire career seen a more uncertain moment?
You know, no. The uncertainty here, what in the math of this in the algebra is the epsilon is absolutely off the chart in so many multi-dimensional ways. I do think Jamie Dimon really captured that nicely in his letter. What I wanted to add value, and I know, Lisa, we've got to get to some serious issues. I love how Kaylee cited the Tina thesis. They played Flock of Seagulls like no other cover band I ever heard. The Tina thesis was just outstanding.
Well, in this is that there is no alternative, and they are a great band. We are looking at a market that is churn, although, as Tom was saying earlier, the dollar ascendant, and we are seeing right now Dow, to your point, lower, but S&P actually resuming some of the gains, and Bed Bath & Beyond, to me, was really the harbinger, perhaps, of what we're going to see among the weaker companies. Tom.
Euro not to a 107 handle, but nevertheless, we're watching weak euro this morning as well. She has had a long 18 hours. Kriti Gupta, after the horror in Brooklyn, was assigned to go deeper to try to understand the geography of Brooklyn in this manhunt for Frank James. We get a briefing now. Kriti?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we covered really throughout the morning, we are still seeing a suspect at large. I think the headline this morning is that this is now the suspect and now not the person of interest. And this, of course, comes after Frank James was connected to a rented U-Haul vehicle. The keys left at the subway platform on 36th Street Station, and that rented U-Haul really connected to addresses in Philadelphia and Milwaukee. That's really all we know in terms of who Frank James is. Of course, some of the social media presence leading to some questions about his background, but for now, that manhunt is ongoing.
Let's go there delicately, and that it is a new world. We've seen that in Ukraine with the whole new Biden intelligence on Ukraine, adapting to the transfer of news by social media. We have the official statements. We have the official news organizations. Of course, the privilege of speaking to the mayor a bit ago. All those people are looking at this amazing social media feed, some of it confirmed, some of it accurate, some of it not. What of the social media has caught your attention?
Well, I think it's really coming to how the police force is actually using social media. I'm going to pin this on actually the manhunt and the way they're actually trying to tackle this person. We know there were issues with the surveillance cameras early on, and now it looks like they're trying to and really making pleas on social media for tips, for hotlines, and that's pretty standard practice. But what isn't standard is necessarily looking at surveillance footage, not necessarily just from the subway station, from the surrounding area, but actively on social media. And I think that's really a new era in terms of finding the shooter at large.
Pretty good to thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it. A conversation this morning with the mayor of New York.
Based on the briefing from my law enforcement officials and based on the evidence that we were able to accumulate, he has now been upgraded to a suspect. And we're asking all New Yorkers to assist us in his apprehension. Please do not approach him. If you see him or if you know about his whereabouts, please notify law enforcement.
Can you tell us what you and all of your staff have learned about Mr. James in the last 6 or 7 hours?
Well, you know, this is moving and it's extremely fluid. There's a host of evidence that we have been recovering. The NYPD, the FBI, as well as our state law enforcement entities have all collaborated together. I cannot say enough about the fast work that you are witnessing. They had to piece together this case from the van arrival here to the city, to the devices, to the things that we collected. They're doing a great job in bringing this person to justice.
Mayor, I want to talk here about what we're going to do, as Governor Hochul said, about crime. You know the numbers in Chicago. You don't know the numbers here. I would say that you are arguably the most qualified politician in the nation with your experience from Bushwick years ago out to where you are now to talk about this. First, on cameras, in amendments and civil liberties and all that. London is is covered with cameras after terror events. Is this the tipping point where New York City, 1/5 of the cameras of London, begins to monitor the public like London?
Well, I think that I have been talking about this since the time I took office in January. I sent my deputy mayor of public safety across the globe to find out how are we protecting human beings throughout the entire globe. And we are not going to sit back and allow this technology to exist and not protect the people of the city. And we're going to continue to explore it.
Mayor Adams, you also had put more police forces into subway stations to protect the people of the city, given that this is just one in a series of events that have unfolded over the last year during the pandemic, even in subway stations, acts of violence. Clearly that failed yesterday. I know you've said you've given yourself an incomplete on crime in the first 100 days of your campaign. Is that incomplete looking more like a failure, less like anything of semblance of a passing grade?
Well, we should be clear. We've been here before as New Yorkers. You know, I often talk about my mid-'80s when I started in the transit police, ironically. And I'm aware of what it takes to turn around generational poverty, generational crises that feed violence in our cities. And then we cannot ignore the overproliferation of guns. No, NYPD, my administration has not failed. We have removed 1,800 guns off the streets of our cities since being elected. Just think about that for a
Mayor
moment.
Adams, you are expert at the study of gangs. On January 4th, you showed up at a press conference and said, we got to do something about gangs. These kids, 3 dead in the last 24 hours, not the headlines like Brooklyn, but 3 dead on Gates Avenue, on Etna Avenue, on Laconia Avenue. What are we going to do about the gangs that pull these kids into crime and violence?
Got to zero in. It's called precision policing, not just throwing out a wide net, but having a precision approach to those who are trigger pullers and violent gangs. That is at the heart of our crises.
They're the mayor of New York City in an important conversation, and we really need to be abundantly clear that we had a headline at that moment of the apprehension of a suspect, and that was corrected by ABC. We're sorry for that. And that happens within the news flow that we have. Tom Keene with Lisa Bramwitz on a very different, the open today, the sobriety of the moment in Brooklyn, and of course the national reaction to this. As I mentioned there at the end, Lisa, with Mayor Adams, I'm just as much concerned about 3 dead last night in the gun battles of New York City.
And that, I think, is the right approach to take, honestly, Tom, given the fact that it's really the surge in crime more than this one specific incident that has gotten our attention. And for all of us in New York City who've watched the change during the pandemic, where do we get back to in the new normal, Tom?
Right now, an important conversation. Jamil Jaffer is founder, executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason University, I should say. But far more than that, he is acclaimed across Republican theology of law. His clerkship to Justice Gorsuch, among others, of course, many other duties over his years. Jamil, I want to go back to Chicago. You're a University of Chicago, and a gentleman that I've had the great privilege of talking to many times, Richard Posner, one of the giants of law. His essay of a decade ago, Privacy, Surveillance, and Law. When are we going to understand, given the carnage of these gun battles, that we are going to have to give up privacy for some form of surveillance?
Well, you know, I mean, this is one of the real challenges. You know, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York that killed nearly 3,000 people in one day, we implemented a lot of procedures and government programs to help protect the nation. And those programs were successful. Over the course of the last 20 years, we've avoided a mass casualty terrorist attack here on U.S. soil. We've had some terrorist incidents, but not a mass casualty event like the 9/11 attacks. Part of that was due in part to these significant surveillance measures we put in place, focused on foreigners located overseas and terrorists located overseas to ensure that we were protected. Now, a lot of those surveillance programs have now ended. Congress has taken action to terminate some of them. Some of them have expired over time. People have forgotten about those events or have allowed them to leave their memory. And I fear that not having those capabilities in place could make us more vulnerable to terrorist attacks. And the same is true on a much smaller scale, although a very damaging scale here. 29 people injured or affected by the smoke attacks and the shooting, 10 people shot. You know, we can see that on a smaller scale, but on a larger scale, these surveillance programs are very important to protecting our nation and have done so for the last 20 years since 9/11.
Jamil, can you give us a sense of what you think is behind the rise of crime, in particular gun violence in the United States and in the big cities most particularly?
Well, you know, we have a situation today, as you know, the economy is facing some challenges. We're seeing inflation. There is a longer trend of gun violence. People have more access, and we're not as good at enforcing our existing laws on gun access and the like. You know, we have a lot of laws in place about who can get guns and who can't get them, about illegal weapons and the like. We have to do a much better job enforcing existing laws and talk about how to get those in place and make sure we're doing the right things. And then, look, a lot of it, too, is a culture that we've seen change in our nation, right? We saw the horrific events of January 6th, right? The things, the way that we talk to each other and the way we think about how to deal with our challenges in this country have left the realm of normal discussion in politics and gone to the form of violence. That's a huge problem. We saw aspects of it over the course of the last 2-3 years really ramping up. That, in part, to me, is contributing part of the things we're seeing here, as well as the economic issues.
Jamil, there's a real distinction between a moment born out of a pandemic where a lot of people saw their common livelihoods destroyed versus something that's stickier. And you really raise a good point that we saw a trajectory of gun violence that this adds to, not necessarily a break from the norm. How far could it go? Are we heading back to what we saw in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s?
Well, one hopes that we're not. Obviously, that would be a very troubling trend. We are headed in a direction that looks like that. And the question becomes, how do we arrest that trend, right? Some of that is sociological and cultural. We have to change the way that we deal with one another in this country. It's really become toxic, and we need to address that. Our leaders need to step up and address that in a very robust way. Our leaders themselves have a hard time talking to one another. What do we expect of ordinary Americans, right? And so that's number one. Number two, with respect to the gun laws that we have on the books, we need to start enforcing those laws, right? We have a tremendous number of gun laws on the books, and the president's called for more gun laws. That'll be debated in Congress. But we have a lot on the books today that are not being effectively enforced. We need to focus on enforcing those before we talk about the need for new and additional things to do in this space, in my mind.
Jamil, help me here with the polarity of America. You are one of our legal aces. There's a broad spectrum of opinions. There's polarization, and we see that within this tragedy in Brooklyn, the shooting, crime. What are we going to do about surveillance? You know the story better than anybody listening or watching. How do we get America on the same legal page to get us away from the idiocy of thoughts and prayers?
You know, it's a real challenge. I mean, part of the problem is that I think some of this has to come from the top, right? Part of that's come from the top and our leaders. Our leaders can barely talk to one another in a civil manner. They can't get stuff done in Congress. They can't get stuff done, between the president and the Hill. We need to start having that kind of conversation. Instead of taking potshots at one another, we need to start working productively. As voters and individuals, we have to hold our leaders accountable to that standard, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that standard. You know, all the conspiracy theories that have popped up frankly, on both sides of the aisle, and the way that both sides of the aisle have dealt with problems has not been effective. It's not working, and we've got to change that culture at the grassroots level and expect more of our leaders. And to the extent they don't comply, they don't bring their actions into proper behavior, let's get those people out of office and put in people who will be effective, not people who will make the polarization worse, as we've seen in recent elections.
But we have seen the president to move away from a James Buchanan, a George Mason theology. President Biden clearly leaned to the left in the early days, the weeks, the months of his administration. Now he yanks back almost to a Reagan center. Can the Republicans do the same thing? And maybe they tilt towards whatever the sense of right is, but come back to the center a la Reagan. Do the Republicans have it in them?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, there are a number of great members of Congress out there who are making efforts to do things like this and work in a bipartisan way. You've seen the Problem Solvers Caucus up on the Hill that's having a real impact up there. And so there are good signs, right? There are people like on the Republican side of the aisle, Mike Gallagher, Mike Waltz, right? On the Democrat side, Abigail Spanberger and Alyssa Slotkin. There are people who can come to the center and find a way to work together. The thing is, we've got to convince our leadership and, frankly, the electorate that plays these primaries beneficiaries, that's the kind of thing we need to get America moving forward again, particularly in this time of increasing inflation and economic challenges.
Do you think that it also has to do with more resources for law enforcement, or do you think that that's sufficient? It's just the actual attitude and the approach taken?
Well, we have seen a walk back in resources and prioritization of law enforcement over the last few years as we've started to talk about what law enforcement does here in Virginia, where I live. We've seen the removal of school resource officers from public schools because of a concern of what they do. But of course, that's led to some increases in school violence in those local schools. So it's a real concern. I think what we see here is the need to make sure our police are well-funded, well-resourced, and well-trained, right? We can't not account for that latter part. Training is important. We have to make sure our police are doing the right thing. But the idea of defunding the police or reduce their funding is a terrible idea in a time of increasing crime and economic strife.
Jamil Jaffer of George Mason University, thank you so much for joining us today, formerly of the White House, necessarily under President George W. Bush, I should say. It is time now for the trading diary with what you need to see in the day and the week ahead. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen speaking later this morning in the UN Security Council meeting on Ukraine. Goldman City and Morgan Stanley reporting tomorrow. And FedSpeak, of course, continues. Loretta Mester and Patrick Harker, the latest on the roster. And finally, an ECB rate decision rounding off a short week. Of course, also Tom Keene and myself will be in Washington, D.C. for the kickoff of those IMF meetings at a time when inflation very much at the forefront. And we saw that today, Tom, with respect to PPI and yesterday with CCPI. It's one thing for the U.S. to handle it. It's another thing for nations with a much weaker currency and much more difficult financial circumstances.
Al from New Jersey emails in. Thank you, Al, for listening this morning on Bloomberg Radio. And Al says, are you flying on the same plane? That's not allowed. And no, Lisa has the Gulfstream, Al. And
all right.
You're
going to complain to him.
I'm taking an Uber.
All right. Well, I will say we'll cry for you, and we all will. I will just point to what we're seeing in markets. You are seeing renewed strength after earnings that do show the dynamism that perhaps is singular in the United States when you look at some of the nations that are struggling more. S&P up nearly 0.4%, 4409. The NASDAQ up about 0.75%. We're looking at broad-based strength. What I find interesting is that even after we saw with PPI today coming in at the hottest since back at least 2010 and CPI yesterday, we're still seeing yields come in dramatically. That two-year yield, 2.3%.
Yeah, well, S&P drawdown. I didn't do the Dow. Sorry, S&P drawdown -8% right now. I mean, it's a crater.
Well, we'll get back from John Farrow as he writes drawdown meditation on a day when there is so much to focus on. Coming up, we are going to focus more on what we're going to expect from earnings with the other major banks reporting. Interesting that you're not seeing as much of a hit, even though JP Morgan shares sharply negative after reporting a bigger than expected build in credit loss provisions based on the uncertainty and the inflation. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
From the financial centers of the world, this is Bloomberg Markets with Alex Steele and Guy Johnson.
From New York, I'm Kriti Gupta with Guy Johnson in London. Alex Steele is off. Welcome to Bloomberg Markets. We start off with one of the biggest national news stories this morning and bring you the developments from yesterday's shooting at a Brooklyn subway station. Let's bring you the latest headlines from what we know. Of course, we know that a gunman had opened fire in a subway station after releasing 2 smoke canisters, injuring 23, 10 with a gunshot wound. We are still waiting for updates on their conditions of the victims. We also know that Frank James, age 62, was connected to the crime scene. He has now been upgraded from a person of interest to a suspect, and the manhunt is ongoing. Let's talk about what's coming up next in terms of what the next steps are. And for that, joining us on the phone is Bloomberg legal reporter Patricia Hurtado. Patricia, thank you so much for joining us and, of course, for your diligent reporting on this issue. Let's start there. What comes next in terms of the hunt for Frank James?
Well, now authorities have probable cause to arrest him for the attempted murder of passengers on that train when he opened fire on the commuters on the morning rush hour yesterday. If he is apprehended, and there's apparently a dragnet going on looking for him, if he's apprehended, I guess it will up to be determined whether federal or state authorities prosecute him.
Patricia, do we have any idea at this stage as to motive?
He is apparently last night, in a briefing, the police and federal authorities described him expressing animus against Mayor Eric Adams, his beliefs. He says he is a post-traumatic stress disorder survivor, but doesn't explain. It's a lot of ranting, a lot of anger on these videos he posted on the internet. So they're trying to track down exactly why he came to New York. Apparently he did live in Milwaukee and also had a residence in the Pennsylvania area. So why did he come to New York and do this? What was his motive? It's still unclear.
Talk to us a little bit about what this means for Mayor Eric Adams in particular. We had him earlier on surveillance. He was the one who actually said that he is now being upgraded to the suspect level. But we also know that he has had increased security. Can you talk about the connection between Frank James and Mayor Eric Adams?
Well, it sounds like for James, Eric Adams was a target of his anger, and possibly because Eric Adams has been very public about trying to clean up the city and try to handle or deal with the homeless population. This was also something that James expressed anger about. So he basically seems to have pinpointed his anger on the mayor, and as a result of that, the mayor had his security detail upgraded because they're concerned that he's on the loose, he's a fugitive, and he may try to track the mayor down.
In terms of what New York is like this morning, how Brooklyn is this morning, how the subway system is this morning, are we returned to normal now? Have we got a full subway system up and running? Can you give us an update on that?
Well, the system has already been crushed by the pandemic, and ridership was massively down. It seemed to be slowly trying to recuperate, but I think it's only a third of what it was before the pandemic. People already are struggling with, do we wear masks? Could you possibly contract the virus if you're in a train and people are not wearing masks? And what do you happen if, there are homeless people sleeping on the train? So there's elements of other issues that are already plaguing the transit system. And now the people have this extra layer of concern that they have to look over their shoulder and find out, to determine, is this guy on the trains today?
And Patricia, we know that the school system is also of utmost concern. We know that there were a lot of the local schools in Brooklyn also sheltering in place for much of yesterday. We wonder what that looks like today as we have schools, of course, in session and, of course, closing at 3 p.m. local time. Patricia, I'm also curious about what we hear next when we talk about the New York Police Department, the Fire Department. Any word on when we can get more headlines from them?
No, we're waiting. I guess they're in a waiting game to determine. Right now, there is nothing, scheduled to be announced. I guess they've now determined or announced that there were videos of this guy earlier in the day when he apparently boarded the train further south. He left a U-Haul van down in South Brooklyn, and he got on the train system. So now they're saying those cameras were operating. So it looks like law enforcement is still trying to determine, track his movements and possibly determine where he went, because apparently when the train arrived at 36th Street, he may have gotten off, and now there's this manhunt for him.
This is not the first mass shooting that New York has witnessed over the last few months. Why is this one different, and what do you think New York will learn from it?
Well, I think the component is, if people have been in the New York City subway system, everyone realized how confined the space is. Where do you go? You're on a train. If this train apparently stopped in the middle of the incident where the shooter was setting off smoke bombs and firing at people with a semi-automatic, and it was stopped in the train in the tunnel for a signal, a red signal. Can you imagine in the confined circumstances and the terror? You're trying to get out of that train car and you can't because the doors were jammed. It's particularly harrowing and chaotic situation. So that's the kind of thing that I think is a particularly frightening situation. And we've had earlier incidences in the subways. A woman was pushed to her death in early January in Midtown Manhattan. So that's the kind of thing, that's always a concern for people. But then this extra situation of being in a confined subway car and having a gunman begin firing rounds from a Glock 9mm, that's horrifying.
Patricia, it certainly is. Thank you very much indeed for updating us. We greatly appreciate it. Bloomberg's Patricia Hurtado. We will, of course, continue to keep you updated with the latest developments as they happen. This is Bloomberg.
Earnings season is coming.
The bar is pretty high.
We're going to see lower earnings growth.
The sentiment on financials has been pretty dour.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Tesla's gaining on record deliveries for the first quarter.
The industrial sector is getting hit pretty hard.
Every tick down is a big deal.
With exclusive expert analysis.
There are a couple of things that concern us.
We have to break out a different playbook.
There are opportunities out there.
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
We're back to earnings season in just a moment, but let's tell you what is happening now with the Bank of Canada at the top of the hour. It surprised nobody by raising 50 basis points, the hike coming through as expected. The messaging coming with it is that interest rates will need to rise further. We are going to see the halt of government bond purchases on April the 25th. All of this pretty much in line with expectations. No real market reaction as a result. That is what we're seeing in the Canadian dollar right now, as you can see, barely a blip as a result of that announcement. We are seeing a little bit of action in the bond market, though, certainly in the United States. We're going into a long weekend, something of a short squeeze taking place right now. So certainly the bond market catching a bid, yields coming down very sharply. This as we watch the earnings season develop, start, kick off really in earnest, with JP Morgan starting that season with a reported $524 million loss tied to the market fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the analyst call, Jamie Dimon also spoke of the impact of the Fed's moves.
I would just be cautious. I think what you should expect is volatile markets. Again, that's okay for us. And the Fed, we think the Fed needs to do what they need to do to try to manage this economy and try to get to a soft landing if possible.
Jamie Dimon talking about the fact that he doesn't see any scenario in which volatility doesn't remain elevated. The bank, as a result of that, is significantly upping its provisioning. Basically, JP Morgan is bracing for the worst. So the question is, should you? Let's talk about what we've learned on the earnings call. Let's bring in Bloomberg Wall Street reporter Sonali Basak. Jamie Dimon, the team over at JP Morgan, certainly expecting significant volatility. They're increasing provisioning as a result of that. What message are they sending here, Sonali?
Well, very simply by JP Morgan's Jamie Dimon, what he told journalists this morning is he's not predicting a recession, but is it possible? Absolutely. The other thing he said is that when it comes to those reserve builds, it moves around a lot. These provisions move around a lot, and it could increase by the end of the year, Guy, but it's not for certain whether it will or not. They have to prepare for the bank in any scenario in this case. The other thing you and I were talking about just this morning is the fact that risk is going up in markets with that volatility rising. In this quarter alone, a lot of that pertained to one incident, the nickel market chaos, where they had said $120 million worth of credit losses were tied to this incident. But is this a one-off occasion, or is there more risk on the horizon that can hurt the banks moving forward is the big question.
Sonali, let's talk about the trading revenue here, because we've had quite a streak of really strong trading revenue when it comes not just to JP Morgan, but a lot of its peers. We're going to hear from them tomorrow in your marathon day. But walk us through JP Morgan's results in particular. What are we seeing in terms of volatility, in terms of the VAR?
Yeah, with VAR going up and nickel being a big part of that, the big question does remain what happens if other assets blow out in a very similar way. Right now, as you know, in commodity markets, he called the oil price movements very sharp. He really did say that was going to be a risk to markets here. But there are other risks, Kriti, that they also highlighted, which includes quantitative tightening, which includes high inflation, and it includes the war in Ukraine. So when it came to the outlook moving forward about what that could mean for the bank and investors and the economy at large, after the second half of the year, into the second half of the year is when those risks become a lot blurrier to telegraph.
Okay, well, Kriti brings up tomorrow, so let's talk a little bit about tomorrow, Sonali. What is the read across from today into tomorrow? Tomorrow we get a lot more in terms of the Wall Street Bank reports. What are we going to learn from them? Which is the greatest correlation here to what we've learned from JP Morgan?
Yeah, it's interesting because on one hand you see that the provisioning for credit losses here and you think that's just on the consumer side of things, but you're going to want to see questions from Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs about the health of their corporate customer as well as the consumer. And when you look at Citigroup, remember a lot of these losses that you saw over at JP Morgan were tied to single name securities in Russia. So is Citigroup going to show a repeat in the type of losses that you see in the corporate and investment bank portfolio? Again, are there other losses that we're not accounting for here? Are there other risks on the horizon that could repeat itself? Guy, I do want to point out that even before JP Morgan announced out of this credit loss scenario, they announced about $900 million worth of reserve build here. Analysts were estimating that this is going to rise every quarter until 2024. So the question is that going to be the same outlook for all the other banks? JP Morgan does feel that they're properly reserved at this time, of course, but does that expectation change if the outlook were to get worse into the year?
Shelley, we've talked a lot about the risks here, the downside risks for JP Morgan, for the larger economy, and we should point out, of course, to your point, Jamie Dimon has been very strong in terms of being positive on the consumer and consumer strength. Another way of showing that kind of positivity or that bet essentially on the market is buybacks. And we have also the JP Morgan report a plan for $30 billion in buybacks at a time when S&P 500 buybacks are already at pretty important record levels. That's going to set the tone for